Welcome to the API Security Meetup. Tonight we have a wonderful speaker, Cyan Perez, from coming here talking about security across the clouds. She is an ethical hacker turning into API security over at PNG, where I also work as well. So it's great to see my colleague in action. Tonight, with this conversation, we'd like to thank Engage for putting this together, organizing it with us, as well as the other co-organizer, John Heckler, for putting in the effort to kind of keep doing this month to month. Engage is a 503B organization that helps with no, not 503.
We're for-profit.
For profit, yeah, okay. 503B Corp, or just B Corp.
Certified B Corp.
Certified B Corp. See, I told you yeah. Certified B Corp, for-profit consulting, and honestly, the years that we've been in with Engage for consulting work, they bring the talent to keep educating the people on staff, as well as keeping the community education in the community coming. Especially with next week, we have the C3 meetup here at this Engage office. Come out and do some code, pair with some folks, and have a good time. And without further ado, we'll have Cyan Perez talk about defending the cloud gates.
Well, hey everyone. Super excited to be here. First one, best one. We're talking to you guys today about a lot of things. So offensive security a little bit. I'll lay the land from first, and then we'll go into some things with cloud, how that impacts API security. We'll go through some studies, a few use cases, and then we'll finally finish off with an overview of kind of the entire process from API design and development through IR is considered for security. Nothing too crazy, but here's a little bit of breakdown, kind of things I just said. But main thing here is, if you have any questions, interrupt me, please. I talk fast and I talk a lot, so it might and will be necessary. That being said, let's get started with my favorite topic, myself. I'm from Florida originally, so go Gators and go Tampa. That's fair. I went to UF, studied computer science, and then specialized in security and psychology. A little bit of my professional history, most of it's interning, granted, but first was a startup, did some iOS and web development. Liked it, but it was free labor, so decided to find a paid one for my next summer. PNG took pity. I ended up doing some machine learning and OCR with them, which is pretty cool, granted, but not my cup of tea. Did start dabbling a little bit in security when I got to meet some of the security practitioners at PNG. They showed me Wireshark, TCP packets, and they're like, well, if you really enjoy this might be the career for you. So I went back to school, took some security classes, and then came back for another rotation doing security. So I got to see both offensive and defensive sides, specifically pen testing, purple teaming, and incident response. I loved it again. And I was like, this is the spot. This is where I want to be. So I asked them if I could come back on the pen test team, and they thankfully said yes. Since then, our team has grown to not only be pen testing, but also red teaming. So now it's offensive security as an umbrella, and I'm more red team focused now. But as Rob alluded, I'll be transitioning very soon to a more API security focused role. So hence me being here, getting more involved with the local community, and hopefully get to contribute more and more. But some personal things about me, I like to play violin more for fun now than even before, but I also like the hacks as part of the job, but I also love it on the side. Spikeball and pickleball, just to get outside and off the computer, is a necessity. I do game. People are always shocked when I say I play COD, but I promise you I use the lobby. I hike it a little bit with my dog. That's Zuko, like from Avatar if you're familiar. And then, it's basically it about me. So let's start off with the broadest topic, offensive security. For anyone who's unfamiliar, there's three main teams that I want to touch on as far as offset goes to adversary emulation. The three are pen testing, red teaming, and purple teaming. So the difference is there. Pen testing, you can think of it as shorter scoped, usually a few days to a few weeks, and often more routine. So you're going to go through assets, maybe compliance driven. If you're pen testing as a service, then obviously it's part of your paid service. But the sticks here is one, usually it's white box. Sometimes there's reason for it to be gray box. White box meaning that you see all of the source code, you get all of the architecture diagrams, you know everything. gray box to keep some things private to see what you can kind of get to. Pen testing does emulate both external and internal threats. So that's one thing that we might talk to act teams about if they're like, well, if you didn't get into VPN to get into our internal network first, does the binding really count? Yes, it does. You got interns, vendors, a lot of people get access to the internal network, so we test both. And then we have a lot of tools that we use, a lot of open source for the beauty of the security community, but a lot of them you might be familiar with. So Kali, Burp, Wireshark, Nmap, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other important part about pen testing is that everybody's in the know. So the app team knows that you're testing it, the developers know to be aware, and it's all kind of out there. For red teaming, it's a different story. So it's a longer term, usually about a month to 3 months on average, could be longer. This is more black box, at least initially. Sometimes there's an assumed breach scenario halfway through where you try to go through whatever you couldn't get externally, try it internally at that point. Toolkit, basically anything pen testing related is fair game here too, but you're going to add a lot of vectors here. So red teaming is objective focused. So let's say this building, if this door is locked, and my objective is to get into the building and up 3 flights of stairs or 2 flights, get into this room and get into a safe somewhere. Now there's things like social engineering, there's physical security, there's other things, so there's more tools. Things like C2, Dropboxes, log picks, maybe age domains and email addresses to help with like email detection. Everything like that. And then the last thing, which is a bit newer, is purple teaming. Anybody here familiar with purple teaming out the gate? Okay, sick. So, okay. Definitely going to be teaching a lot of you at least one thing today. Purple teaming is what can be best described as offensive tactics used directly on blue team's defenses. So it's more of a side-by-side activity with SOC and IR to see, okay, there's a new threat actor emerging. They use these TTPs. Can our defenses handle them if they come after us next? So Purple will actually act as an adversary directly with SOC and IR to get those indicators of compromise, those IOCs that we need to be marking on to defend against those prevalent groups nowadays. TTPs? Tools, tactics, and procedures, techniques. To help if they don't claim it, like, oh, we did this. Maybe you can tell by their behavior. It's a bit harder on like the pyramid of pain, if you're familiar, to hide that versus things like hashes. Yeah, toolkit, basically a mix of both of those things, depends on what purple team is up to that time, what the threat actor groups that week are up to. Any questions on OPSEC? Beautiful. Let's go into API hacking specifically. So kind of how does that look like with APIs? So the first thing I thought was obviously OWASP top 10 for APIs. And I feel like that's beating a dead horse. I feel like a lot of you have heard a lot about those top 10. If not, I implore you to go look it up. It's kind of bread and butter of what's most common. It was just updated last year in 2023. So I'll tell you a lot. There's a lot of overlap, I say, with web app, but not completely. But there's still some things to consider. So even if you somehow, some way guarantee OWASP top 10 is patched or remediated, there's other things to consider when it comes to adversaries going against APIs. For instance, the CI/CD pipeline that's being used to deploy them. Can that be abused in any way, not just the assets themselves? Are there, of course, those who color thinking cloud misconfigurations that are introducing some risk outside of just users interacting with that API themselves? Anything that the cloud's offering us that's pricey, but maybe pricey and worth it, that we should be considering. And then, last but not least on this slide, if an incident occurs with your API, do you have proper logging? Do you have proper resources to give incident response to handle that incident accordingly? All things considered, outside of OWASP top 10, but let's go ahead and keep going. One thing that I will plug for anyone considering if you like own APIs, and this is a good time for a disclaimer. Anything I teach you guys today, I am not legally liable if you do anything with it. Please don't. If you don't own it, don't test it. Or if you don't have permission, don't test it. But assuming that you do, there's a tool called Burp Suite that's it's a community edition. It's free. It's great. You're familiar with Postman /Bruno /whatever API tools. you can connect it via proxy through Burp Suite. It's really good to see that traffic and kind of analyze what's moving around. There's a lot of great extensions that the community builds for Burp Suite that you can leverage as well. And my favorite, this is like in favorite order. So Autorize is really cool for testing different levels of access. So back in the old days, you had to go through an application as a admin, and then or go through an API as an admin, and then maybe test it again as a lower privileged user, and then just previously save the admin request and try it with the lower tokens. That's tedious and a lot to document and kind of go through. So Autorize does it automatically. So you go through, you get a lower privilege token, then you go through the API or asset as an admin, and it'll try that lower privilege against the admin endpoints continuously as you go through, which is pretty cool. Param miner, there's a lot of parameters in API docs that are actually not documented. So finding a way to test all of them, even know what they all are, is also very tedious. And things like pen testing especially, you don't have a lot of time. So anything that you can do to kind of speed up time is really helpful. JWTs, we love them, we hate them. There's a few things. The first one, JSON Web Tokens itself, is really good just for editing them in the request. So for those unfamiliar, Burp Suite has a request on the left and the response on the right. They also have the intercept, so you can kind of pause it before it's sent to the server and then modify it before it goes. So if you have something like JSON Web Tokens as an extension, you can edit the JWTs before they're sent off. So it's a pretty easy way to modify it. And then there's also the attacker, which helps automate some of the easier lower hanging fruit attacks for JWTs. It allows you as a pen tester to get those out the way so that we can start getting creative and start trying to chain things together and customize it based on what you know. Last but not least, Open API Parser. Any sort of OSINT or recon that you do where you maybe find some leaked API docs that weren't supposed to be that public, it helps you kind of parse through like anything using Open API, so Swagger as an example. Cool. A little bit about Burp Suite. Any questions there?
No.
Okay. We're gonna go into cloud. So there's two cases that I want to talk about. Hopefully not something you already know, but something that I looked into the past week or so preparing for this that I thought was pretty interesting. Anybody familiar with AWS development? Okay, let me back up. Cloud? How cloud works development? Okay. Something sick. So there's two things I want to talk about, and I'm going to go slow. So the first one is AWS Cognito. The two that I'm going to talk about are Cognito and Lambda Authorizer. There are two ways to kind of authorize users with privileges in AWS. Both of them have some concerns historically that have been identified that are really cool to talk about. So the first one is Cognito. The interesting thing about this, and for those unfamiliar with serverless, basically AWS has something called lambdas that you can kind of package your functionality into it. So it could be like a Python lambda, it could be a JavaScript lambda. And you don't need a server. You don't need that dedicated hardware. You can kind of expand on demand what you need to run those based on who's hitting your APIs or who's hitting your clients. So one way to authorize is Cognito. They have something called identity pools and user pools. So user pools are the users themselves. Identity pools are created as a way for developers to assign privileges to users to the AWS resources that they would need to access. So for instance, if I have an API backend for a website that takes in puppy pictures, I want to upload pictures of Zuko to this site. I'm going to need access to the Lambda to do that, and also the S3 bucket to upload the image to, maybe a DynamoDB table to also upload like the metadata of that image. So that's one way to do it. The caveat is that this path right here is not necessary. You don't actually have to be authenticated to get access to an identity pool. You can be unauthenticated. This is an issue if you're not actually restricting that access to least privilege as you should. And so what Arminis, the actual found, and his link's at the bottom, this is his work, not mine, let me caveat that, is he found that this is actually a pretty common misconfiguration. It's pretty unnoticed until it was noticed. So the way that he did it was he was in AWS just with read-only permissions. He was doing a cloud engagement, and the identity pool ID was readable for him. And fun fact, it's also readable in applications in the wild too. So just matter of getting the application, you can find the ID. Once you have that, you can use that to go through the second path and just directly go to the identity pool and ask for some authenticated credits. Then you can see, okay, I got it. How much can I actually do with it? If it's juicy, then you can use that to actually enumerate and list, most commonly, resources in AWS. What does that mean? Things like lambdas, if you can list them, you can oftentimes see environment variables. These are where we store things like access keys, API keys, Perez. Very, very bad stuff. And so for an unauthenticated user to be able to do this is pretty severe. Not to mention that he found that he could actually extrapolate this past just his current engagement and scrape the entire public internet, or most of it that he could fathom, for any sort of identity pool IDs that were out there in applications. He did this with not only Android applications, but also, I believe, web apps via Common Crawler, I think it was. And I was spending like $300 trying to parse through all the data and get the information, but he did it. At the end of the day, he was able to see 13,000 non-public S3 buckets, 1,200 echo entity tables, 1,500 Lambda functions. Yeah, I think it was like a third of the Lambdas had sensitive data within them as well. So very, very easy and trivial way to privilege escalate in an environment where you previously had no access at all.
Yeah, AWS consider this a vulnerability.
Great question. So,
Repeat the question.
oh yeah, so if AWS considered this a vulnerability. So from what I remember from Andres's report, that he did tell AWS. And they did, it was one of those things where it's like a feature, not a bug. However, like developers that need to do better versus AWS needs to tighten up. I believe ultimately became a documentation thing where they kind of specified and helped put some guidelines in the doc saying, make sure that you restrict these things properly. If you don't, there's some considerations. And there are some considerations as well with how AWS assumed that process runs for APIs. So I believe this, they assume that either it goes all the way back to the client here, or sometimes it doesn't. It stays from an API maybe through the gateway directly to the services. And that could impact the amount of permissions that identity has. Versus go all the way back to the client, maybe not so much. So also the documentation thing. Yeah, but cool. Second one has a bit more slides to it, so I'll take it slow. But this is Lambda authorizer. So different Lambda auth in AWS, but also different type of vulnerability and tag vector. So Lambda authorizers give permissions to resources in this type of format with policy, action, well, for them, policy, effect, action, resource, context, or conditions. But there's an issue here. So this line, this line right here, the resource, and that orange string is basically what's telling it what that identity can access. So we have region, account. For more intuitive things, or things like stage, so like prod, non-prod, dev, HTTP verbs, post, put, delete. The resource, so let's say dashboard or homepage, and then the child resources, so dashboard / user login, right? Now, the funny thing is that they allow wildcard the asterisk. And what a lot of developers don't know, and the documentation was not clear, is that wildcard is pretty greedy when it comes to the permissions that it gives, and not intuitively. So we're going to play a little game. We have this arm right here. And I kept some of the right-hand sides you can compare. So prod is our stage. And the context that we have is that we want all users to have access to all the HTTP verbs to use. And we want the users to also have access to any child resource of the dashboard. So anything past that / dashboard path, they should be able to access. So the way that we do that, going into the docs in this screenshot, is prod and asterisk where that HTTP verb would be, dashboard, and then an asterisk afterwards. Make sense? These are some example endpoints. Dashboard user login, dashboard user logout. Any initial issues that anyone sees with the before okay.
I can delete all the users.
Rob says that you can delete all the users. Rob, how would you do that?
Well, it's any method, which is delete, and I can get to dashboard user, which most likely gives me access to the user table, which then purges data.
That would be true. I did not provide proper constraints. Delete is not listed in the current endpoints. So I like the way that he thinks, and you should be thinking the same exact way. Now, I'm going to add some more valid endpoints to consider. Any issues with this? Mm-hmm. So the issue here is that, actually not fun fact, that asterisk applies to both these endpoints. So according to this, end users could access both of those admin paths as well. Why? Because this asterisk right here expands like indefinitely in both directions until it hits prod, or in this case, the HTTP ver, and then the /dashboard. So in this case, post /dashboard, everything in between is being included in that allow. Terrifying. As someone who's done within development, I would make this mistake for sure. So I definitely see how devs do it. But it's something that is very concerning before AWS typically did. So let's go ahead and see how to mitigate it. So now where the previous kind of ARN definition was, now we have conditions. So previously when this was first discovered, there was not as much access to conditions to help you specify that without the wildcards or without having a million different things listed. So with conditions, we are able to restrict permissions more granularly, while also still abiding by the overall kind of park format that AWS insists on. One of the things here to consider with developers for APIs is that that format isn't necessarily intuitive. It's more intuitive, I'd say, to operators than it is, or operations than it is to developers. So it's another thing to kind of add on to the developer workload is learning this format and now also the security implications behind it. But again, conditions that were implemented help. The other only thing that I would say is to use asterisks at the very end of the path if you can help it. Now, obviously, that goes back to the design of the application and the API, but if you can help it, at the end is the best bet.
Can't you explicitly list the bird?
You mean in the instead of putting the asterisk here, you could. Yeah, that'd be one way. Expanding it out. There's also no reason why anyone should have access to all HTTP verbs in the first place. But yeah, take a listen to it. Awesome. Cloud takeaways. So 3 things that a lot of us probably already know. 1, documentation is to learn, not to secure. So even if they say, this is good for security, always be skeptical. A lot of the things in the documentation, as I showed you with the past 2 examples, were incorporated because security researchers pointed out to them. So stuff like this warning here was added after something was brought to their attention. So along that line, to the last point, be good security stewards. If you see anything in the documentation that's not clear, it could be helpful to report that to AWS, even if it's not its own vulnerability, just to help out your fellow developers. And the middle depth is incredibly crucial, especially in terms like this. Serverless, things get blurry. It's not the same, the container on a server that's hosting a website. Now there's a lot of things in between it that can get convoluted. So do you have eyes on everything in the middle? And on the right-hand side, this is how my perspective was as a weak computer science student. Loved dogs, hated writing them. Now, I hate both. Because one is misleading and the other one's tedious. But that's obviously hyperbolic. Still read docs, they're important. And still write them well, also important. So, I'll kind of blown through this. So, the last thing to consider is the end-to-end. So, this might be slightly familiar to anyone who's done API development. This would be a really fun diagram. However, security is only mentioned once in this entire thing. Operate the API as a subsection under monitor during operation. It's first in the list, so I'll give them points for that. But in reality, as we're all painfully aware, security should be at every single stage of this lifecycle. Some examples that I'm going to call out for why that is first, there's something called KringleCon, which is a capture the flag competition that SANS does around the holidays. So SAN themed, there's a little elf running around, it's really cute. But one of the challenges, I believe 2 years ago, was actually a CI/CD attack vector. So you actually looked in, not to spoil it, if you want to go after this, plug your ears. But for this case, you were able to actually see in previous Git commits some previously push sensitive credentials. They made it a little easy. They made the message on my commit like, whoopsies. So we were like, oh, wonder what they pushed here. But it's a note to developers that if you commit something, overwrite it later, it's still in your commit history. Right, so that was a pretty easy way to get in. Then also figuring out how to use, it was an SSH key. Using that to, one pull out the SSH repo for Git, use that to authenticate to it. And then from there, you're able to push anything into like the YAML file to run certain commands. Those familiar with reverse shells, this guy ended up, or for this, you could just create a PHP reverse shell and get access to the server that way. It's pretty fun. But a little bit later on in the pipeline, you have the WAF, which we all love and hate. A lot of people think the WAF is indestructible, and it very much is not. One of the things, there's a lot of WAF evasion techniques that you can look up out there that could still be valuable. There's a lot of automated tools like WAF to look at misconfigurations in WAFs, but it's also things like older versions of WAF. So in this case, the request body size. Older versions of Azure's WAF allowed larger request bodies. These would be used to evade WAF, but in the newer ones, it's limited, but there's still older ones live today. So still being able to use these things that are historically relevant is one way. And last but not least, this is a really cool, gotta give credit to one of my coworkers for showing me this literally like earlier this week. But weaponizing plain text ASCII as an escape sequence. Very, very interesting stuff. This plays into logging and monitoring. So when you store logs, the way that it parses those logs, basically in certain situations, can allow for injection. So consider an incident. An incident responder is going through your logs, and through like hacking your logs, that also gets hacked. Concerning. So there's a lot of things to consider throughout the entire way, from deploying the application, managing it, responding to incidents that could all pose concern. Not to make you too stressed. I don't condone drinking heavily. Please be responsible. But, in our field of work, all things considered, right, from all angles of things, it's pretty significant stuff. I believe we have reached the end. Thank you guys so much. I will take any more questions. Starting with Mr. Bowen.
With weaponizing plain text ASCII, is that
Yes.
also akin to the Log4j vulnerability?
Great question. So, similar. Oh my god. So, the question was, is this weaponizing plain text ASCII kind of similar to Log4j vulnerability that was discovered? Similar in concept of log injection, but instead of the LDAP, it's more just the sequencing of ASCII escapes. So, same concept, different way to do it. Yeah, good question. Fun fact, Log4j, person found in Minecraft. If you're a Minecrafter.
Well, it's still a problem.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Still known today, so be careful when you're crafting. Any other question about OffSec, cloud? Any?
Can you go back to the slide with the list of things on the work week?
Yes, sir. Got you. And I'll also send out the slide deck afterwards, too.
Okay.
I recently ran into an issue with my phone storage being full, even with cloud, so I'm very cautious of that nowadays.
That's a whole different problem.
Yeah.
Cloud storage.
Touche. Also, an issue with AI. All the data junk that it generates, how much it costs just to store that junk. If you're like me, I would store that junk, thinking I'm going to use it in a year or so.
It's like my garage. My house. Oh, yeah. That was good. With OffSec, are you familiar with the dark net where they're building a malware GPT? Have you looked into that at all?
I haven't, but for some reason that's terrifying.
No, it actually is an action being used. They're creating polymorphic malware from GPT.
That's insane power, seeing as a lot of AI generated code cannot run off the jump. So for them to trust it, I guess, at least gets you most of the way there.
Yeah.
Which is the first run. It's a huge learning curve to develop. Unless you have AI. Thanks for that. Can't wait till I'll sleep tonight.
Now, I've heard of stories of using the CVEs to generate malware.
Interesting concept. Using CVEs to generate the malware?
Yes.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, one of WordPress's biggest successes, it's very downfall, the popularity of it means anytime the CVE comes out, all the previous versions that are vulnerable get hacked. But if I have all the CVE data, now I can see all the patterns, start making polymorphic, and start attacking every version.
Very interesting. Leveraging CVEs to attack every version historically, not just the current one. Very nice. So yeah, I really love that I'm here. I'm learning a lot about the presenter. Any general comments, thoughts?
So how often do you do pen testing?
Oh, great question. So when I was more on the pen testing side of things, every day, all day, there's always a pen test. Once in a while, you get a break just to do research and personal training and stuff. But usually day in, day out. I always caveat this with saying that a lot of pen testing is actually not pen testing for researching. Sometimes I'm too good at figuring out all those low-hanging fruits really fast, and then it becomes a matter of, okay, the bang your head on the wall. Like, I'm pretty sure this isn't vulnerable, but what if it is? You always assume that it is, and just keep going until you run out of ideas. Or run out of time, most likely.
But if you were an app dev team and you have, APIs that you're exposing, how often should you have then test any rules and any best practices there?
Any best practices for dev teams to test their own assets? Great question. So, especially with internal pen testing, a lot of APIs and apps actually don't get pen tested because they're not critical enough. And so, even though that's the norm across the industry, the other ones still need to get tested. And if you can't rely on that, then you have to rely on yourselves and still be kind of good security stewards internally. That's a good leeway to note on tooling that you can incorporate into CI/CD pipelines. They're not holy grails, not catch-alls, but things like Sneak for static code analysis, Wiz for cloud resources, No Name, namely for API security, are all beneficial and at least give you more visibility and a better grasp on parsing through those vulnerabilities and patching things in advance. Part of hopefully my role this coming up few weeks will be making my old team's job a little bit harder, securing APIs before they get stuck. So, fingers crossed for me.
How many, in your experience with pen testing, how many times were you fighting false positives because, like, for instance, cores gets flagged, but in APIs, cores doesn't really matter?
Right. So this is what I always say when people have a well-meaning but off comment of, isn't pen testing just running it through burp and like exporting the findings from burp? Or does it do anything after that? A lot of it is false positives. Not only that, but there's also a lot of things from automated tooling that can't do things like abuse business logic vulnerabilities, or do more creative evasion techniques that human eye can probably do. So a lot of time, but it's also good, like, you get a trend, an idea of how these tools often report false positives. So at some point you get an eye of, like, that's not a vulnerability. Like, you might go a brief cursory check, but at some point you're pretty certain when it's false positive off the product.
So does Burp have a way to modify the rule set when you do find false positives and don't get reported again?
Actually, I don't know. I don't think I ever tried to report it back to Burp Suite to make them stop. I figured the algorithm is pretty static. It feels like a machine learning one, a self-learning one. That could be interesting. Maybe there's capability. Back to being a good security steward. I like it. So, awesome. Well, thank you.